evening, everyone. How's everyone doing tonight? Everybody enjoy that nice weather? Everybody get out to enjoy that? I personally took a walk, so I just enjoy it a little bit. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Lenora Henson. I'm the Curator and Director of Public Programming here at the Theodore Roosevelt inaugural site. And on behalf of our Board of Trustees and staff, I'd like to welcome you to our February speaker night. I'd especially like to welcome Dr. Nicholas Silvestri, whose topic this evening is Neurological Ailments of U.S. Presidents. Speaker night is our opportunity on the fourth Tuesday of most months to invite experts to come in and help us think not only about some of the issues that were important during TR's time and continue to be relevant today, but also the presidency itself. Dr. Silvestri, who is a Western New York native, grew up in Kenmore and is a clinical associate professor of neurology at UB's Jacobs School of Medicine and Biomedical Sciences. He's also a longstanding history buff, and tonight he's going to be combining those two loves and sharing some of his insights with us. I just want to mention a couple of awards he's gotten. Just as mentioned, in 2013, he got the Excellence in Teaching in Adult Neurology from the UB Neurology Residency Program. And in 2011, he was awarded the Best Teacher for the UB Adult Neurology Residency Program. So we are in excellent hands. His credentials go on for miles.
Don't embarrass me.
We won't embarrass him. So I'm going to turn over the podium to Dr. Silvestri. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Thank you so much. This is an honor for me. I'm actually, as Laura mentioned, I'm a huge history buff. And as I was mentioning, as mentioned all along, when I put this talk together a couple of years ago, it was kind of after I'd gone through this period in time where I'd read a bunch of presidential biographies and noticed how sickness and health really affected some presidencies, as we'll go through. And my wife had said that you're combining your profession with your hobby, and I think you think it's interesting, but no one else will. But I've given this talk now probably 20 to 25 times. I've given it to medical audiences, to non-medical audiences. I try to change it up a little bit every time, but the themes are the same. And I truly hope you enjoy it. So let's get started. So I'll start off by just talking a little bit about the presidency, and then we'll talk about some medical stuff too. So very basically, the powers of the president are outlined in the second article of the Constitution. Up to this point, 45 men have held the office. It turns out that the only qualifications to become president are you have to be 35 years old and a U.S. citizen, and after that, anything goes. Of note, 8 have died while in office, including obviously President McKinley, which is how TR became president. In terms of causes of death, most of the presidents have died of heart disease, but 9 have died of infection, and this is in the pre-antibiotic era when folks died of things like tuberculosis or pneumonia with regularity. 8 presidents have died of stroke or complications of stroke, and we'll spend a lot of time talking about that this evening, as stroke is a neurological illness. 4 presidents have been assassinated. We'll talk about that in a minute. 2 have died from respiratory failure, 2 from bleeding from their GI system or their gastrointestinal system. Martin Van Buren, pictured here, died of an asthma attack, which seems unthinkable in this day and age. And only one of our presidents' cause of death is listed as cancer, and that's U.S. Grant, who died of esophageal cancer, possibly predisposed by his smoking and alcohol history. In terms of assassinations, as you can see, 4 of our presidents have been assassinated. Lincoln and Kennedy were both shot in the head. Lincoln survived for about 8 hours after he was shot in the head. Kennedy died instantaneously. And the presidents pictured in the middle, James Garfield and William McKinley, obviously McKinley near and dear to our hearts here in Buffalo, both died not really of their gunshot wounds, which were both to the abdomen, but of an overwhelming infection as a result of, in Garfield's case, repetitive probing of his wound with unsterile fingers, and in McKinley's case, by gangrene that developed in his pancreas, an organ responsible for a lot of our endocrine function, because they could never really find the bullet in his case, and the bullet in the wound caused gangrene and led to his ultimate death. Not every time an assassination attempt has been made has the assassin been successful. Here on On the left shows Andrew Jackson, who was attempted to be assassinated on the steps of the Capitol, but he actually fought off his attacker with his own walking stick. And most people in the room probably remember President Reagan's attempted assassination shortly after he took office in 1981. Obviously both, Jackson's was not successful either, it was Reagan's. Reagan survived his gunshot wound. Interestingly, probably many folks in this room know that TR was shot after he was president. It was on the 1912 campaign trail when he ran in the Bull Moose Party. I find it to be a fascinating story. He was shot in the chest before his speech he was giving in Wisconsin, I believe. What saved him really was that the bullet passed through not only his coat, but his 50-page speech and his glasses case. And it lodged in his chest, in his fourth rib on the left side of his chest. And had he not had that speech, had it not been so long, it very well may have shot him in the heart and killed him on sight. So good for TR and his long-winded speeches. Moving on, several of our presidents have suffered from migraine. Pictured here are Thomas Jefferson and Dwight Eisenhower. In Eisenhower's case, it may have been aggravated by the fact that he was a 4-pack per day unfiltered Camel cigarette smoker. But as you can see, several of our other presidents have suffered from migraines as well. In Alzheimer's disease, so far, as far as we know, that is, only one of our presidents had suffered from Alzheimer's disease, Ronald Reagan. I point out that he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's in 1994, which is 6 years after he left office. As you recall, he served from 1981 to 1989. When I was putting this talk together, I was interviewed by a gentleman from NPR who really was he should have been an attorney. He kept leading me to say that Reagan had Alzheimer's when he was in office, but in point of fact, that would be a little unusual to have Alzheimer's or symptoms of Alzheimer's 6 years before one is diagnosed. Usually it's picked up on a little bit earlier than that. What's also remarkable about Reagan is that he lived with Alzheimer's disease for about 10 years, which is also fairly unusual, dying at the age of 93. He actually died the day I moved to Boston to do my residency, so it was kind of a sad day for me. I had to leave Buffalo for a few years, and one of my heroes growing up passed away. But I want to tell you the story today, the two major stories of two of our presidents. We'll start with Woodrow Wilson, and then we'll end with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who are really remarkable in how they dealt with their neurological illnesses. And so we'll start with Wilson, who's I'm not even sure if I should be talking about Woodrow Wilson in this building, one of TR's rivals, but we'll talk about Woodrow Wilson, Thomas Woodrow Wilson, who served as president from 1913 to 1921. He's actually the only president that has served that has had a PhD. He had a PhD in political science from Johns Hopkins. And prior to becoming president, he was the president of Princeton University, his alma mater, and he was the governor of New Jersey. So Wilson had a very complex medical history before he took office. He was dyslexic, and dyslexia popularly is described as reading things backwards, but in point of fact that's not true. Dyslexia just means that one has difficulty reading. And it's fairly remarkable that he was as accomplished as he was, PhD, fairly prominent professor in his day, given the fact that dyslexia was certainly underdiagnosed, certainly not treated, but he overcame it notwithstanding. But he also had high blood pressure, and that becomes very important throughout the course of our story here, because high blood pressure predisposes to stroke. He had recurrent stomach aches or dyspepsia. He was one of the presidents that suffered from migraines. He had narrowing of his arteries, or atherosclerosis. He had a bleed or a hemorrhage into his left eye in 1906, which left him partially blind in that eye. And as you can see from this picture, he had really bad teeth, which likely he wouldn't have been very successful in politics this day and age with teeth like that. He had recurrent episodes of symptoms in his right hand. And if you read any medical history of Woodrow Wilson, there's an assertion out there that Wilson had a history of strokes dating back as far as 1896. And that's a little unusual because to have strokes which are caused by lack of blood going to the brain, to have them in such a small area of the brain over and over and over and over again without having a major stroke over the course of 20 years would be extremely unusual. But what they described it as is that he had right upper extremity or right arm neuritis, and he had these episodes over and over again where he would have such severe pain in these two fingers that even though he was a right-handed gentleman, he became left-handed. He started to write left-handed and golf left-handed, that his right hand hurt him so much. Probably what he suffered from was carpal tunnel syndrome, which is a pinched nerve at the wrist, which can lead to pain in the hand and not recurrent strokes. But I find it remarkable that his solution to his symptoms was he was just going to switch hands. I mean, I can't even golf well right-handed, so I can't imagine how that would have affected me. What Wilson is known mostly for is the fact that he was our president during the First World War. And in fact, he spent most of his term keeping us out of the First World War until circumstances really led the U.S. to join the war. But one of the legacies that he had was he wanted to create the League of Nations, which was the 14th point in his 14 points of peace. So after the war was over, Wilson and many world leaders decided that such a travesty could never happen again, such a massive loss of life should never happen again, and he went to Versailles, to the negotiations post-World War I, and really, stuffed the 14 points down everyone's throat. And pretty much everyone bought it, except for the U.S., except for Congress at that time, because Congress was a Republican-dominated body, and he was a Democrat. And the sticking point, really, for people like TR's friend Henry Cabot Lodge, who was a major Republican congressman at that time, was that the 14th point, the creation of the League of Nations, he felt, and the Republicans felt, would further entangle the U.S. into European affairs in the future. It basically was the precursor to the United Nations, and the Republicans said, from this point on, we never want to get involved in this again. We need to isolate ourselves again. We don't want any part of this. And so Wilson, realizing that he could not overcome the Republican majority in Congress, decided to take his plea to the people. And so he went on a tour, and he called it the Tour to Join the League. So he boarded a train, and he went across the country and gave speeches to the people to appeal to their congressmen to make us ratify the Treaty of Versailles, let us join the League of Nations. And so he boards the train shortly after he returns from Versailles in the fall of 1919, and on September 25th of that year, he gives his last public address. And he starts to experience severe headaches. And then he starts to experience some episodes of weakness on the left side of his face. Now, many of you have probably seen public service ads, and you know that if you have speech difficulties, or if you have weakness on one side of your face, or weakness on one side of your body, that is probably the sign of a stroke, and you should seek immediate medical attention. Well, even in 1919, Woodrow Wilson's physician, Dr. Cary Grayson, who was a naval physician and Wilson's personal physician, said, "This doesn't look good to me. Something bad is about to happen. We have to cancel the tour." So much to Wilson's chagrin, the tour is canceled, and the train goes back to D.C. And then, on October 2nd, 1919, Mrs. Wilson finds Mr. Wilson on the floor of his bathroom and is unable to move his left side, and realizing that something bad has probably happened, hit the White House doctors, Dr. Grayson and others, summoned Francis Dercum from the University of Pennsylvania. Dercum was the eminent neurologist of his day, so they summoned him to Washington, and Dercum diagnosed President Wilson with a stroke, likely on the right side of his brain. So the right side of your brain controls the left side of your body, and vice versa, and that's the diagnosis he's given. And you can see in these photos, now these are photos taken much after his stroke. In fact, I think these are photos taken after Wilson leaves the White House. He's got his arm kind of held in this fisted position, this kind of flexed and fisted position. And you can see it over here as well as this gentleman is helping him down the stairs. And this is on the left side, obviously. This is a sign of a chronic injury to the right side of the brain, such as in a stroke. So he had a very clear evidence of a left hemiparesis after his stroke. But another interesting phenomenon that happens when people have strokes on the right side of their brain, particularly in the right frontal area and the right parietal area, these areas here of the brain, is that they can develop this phenomenon which in medical parlance we call anosognosia. And basically what that means is that patients with this problem fail to recognize that they have a problem at all. Sometimes it's so severe that patients with right-sided brain lesions fail to recognize the left side of their body as their own, or the left side of space as existing at all. And so to an extent, Wilson had this. He minimized over and over after his stroke that the left side was a major problem, that he had any problems at all, to the point where, as we'll see, he wanted to run for a third term as president. Back in those days you could, and it wasn't until almost the very end, almost very close to the Democratic National Convention of 1920, that it was decided he should not run. So after the stroke, what happens is really interesting, and this could never really happen again. His physician orders isolation, and so arguably medical care was a lot different 100 years ago. They really reacted to disease as opposed to proactively treated the disease. And Grayson says, you just need to be we need to remove all stress, you need to be out of the limelight. So he isolates him, and the public doesn't know about his stroke until about 5 months later, in mid-February, and he doesn't have a cabinet meeting with his advisors until April. And so really the question is, what was going on for these 6 or 7 months? And the answer is that Mrs. Wilson seemed to be running the White House. So Edith Bolling Galt Wilson was Wilson's second wife. Wilson's first wife died during his first term, and Wilson was devastated by it, but he was able to rebound. And Mrs. Galt was a Washington socialite who took to President Wilson. But when Wilson was incapacitated by the stroke, which probably wasn't just during the 6 or 7 month period, it was probably for the remainder of his presidency, the assertion is that Mrs. Wilson was running the show. For example, she likely ordered the veto of the Volstead Act. Now, the Volstead Act was the mechanism by which prohibition was put into place, but she vetoed this. And later on, after Mr. Wilson passed away, folks asked her, well, what was really happening then? And she was kind of defensive, and she said, and I quote, "The only decision that was mine was what was important and what was not, and the very important decision of when to present matters to my husband." So she essentially was setting the presidential agenda. She was probably showing him things that she felt like he needed to at least look at, so in good conscience he could say yay or nay. But in point of fact, the assertion is she and possibly Dr. Grayson were running the show. Now the question is, why wasn't the vice president running the show? Wilson's vice president was Thomas Marshall, who was put on the ticket, it's alleged, to win the Midwest vote. He was from Indiana, but he wasn't really held in high esteem by Wilson or his cabinet, and so he was largely left out of the picture. So fast forward a year, and elections are coming up, and Wilson, as I mentioned before, is intent that he wants to run again. His assertion was, there's nothing wrong with me, and I've spent the last 4 years of my presidency dealing with foreign issues. I want to now deal with domestic issues, and moreover, I want to make sure the League of Nations, the Treaty of Versailles is ratified in the States, and the League of Nations is joined. The Democrats, I think, really late, if you read about this, really late in the process, decide it's not a great idea. And so instead of putting Wilson and his buddy Tom Marshall here back up, the ticket is James Cox for the Democrats and Warren Harding for the Republicans, and obviously Harding wins the election. Now I know this is not trivia night, but can anyone tell me who James Cox's running mate was? Right, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And so there's a good segue here, because it's important to point out that in 1920, FDR was kind of the rising star in the Democratic Party. He was not yet, he was actually Assistant Secretary of the Navy in Wilson's cabinet, which is ironic because, as you know, TR was Assistant Secretary of the Navy in McKinley's first cabinet. But there was a lot to protect in FDR's image, as we'll talk about. So what was kind of the fallout of this? Well, in 1967, many years later, almost 50 years later, the 25th Amendment was passed. And the 25th Amendment clearly outlines presidential succession. In other words, in the event that the president is unable to carry out the duties of his office, the vice president becomes president, et cetera, et cetera. There are 4 sections to this amendment. Section 4 is the only section of that amendment that's never been invoked. And essentially what it says, to paraphrase, is that if the vice president and the majority of the cabinet feel that the president is for some reason unable to carry out the duties of office, the vice president can take over. And so this could be straightforward, right? I mean, if the president is somehow incapacitated, obviously succession would occur. But if, let's say, the vice president and some of the cabinet members decided that a president was psychiatrically unstable to be president, or let's say a president did develop Alzheimer's disease while in office, This could become contentious because it's a matter of opinion, and it would go to the Supreme Court, and it can be messy. So this has never been invoked before. Hopefully it never will be invoked. But as a result of the Wilson saga, there is a mechanism in place that more clearly outlines presidential succession so that, let's say, the First Lady or the First Gentleman, if it ever comes to that, won't be setting the presidential agenda, but it'll actually be someone who was elected into office. So this doesn't happen, basically. So, sign here, Tom, or sign here, Woodrow. You notice what hand he's using here. He's using his right hand again because he couldn't use his left hand. So this is a pretty interesting picture where, this is kind of what my wife does when she tells me to write the bills, I guess, but that's all online these days. Okay, so Wilson dies 4 years later in 1924. The death scene is that he develops digestive difficulties, whatever that means. He falls into unconsciousness and dies hours later. And on his death certificate, Grayson, who's still his physician, says that he died of late effects of stroke. I don't think so. He probably died of a GI bleed, a bleeding in his gastrointestinal system or something like that, but probably not as a result of his stroke. So, what I find, there's a lot of intriguing points about this story, really, but one of the interesting things is how long Wilson's stroke was kept from the public. Now, obviously, in this day and age, with media as it is and social media as it is, this would never happen, but, we'll point out that this was not the first cover-up, it won't be the last cover-up. This here is Grover Cleveland, another president with a lot of Buffalo ties. During his presidency, Cleveland developed cancer of his mouth, of his upper palate. And this was never known during his lifetime or during his presidency. How it was treated was he was taken out on a U.S. Navy ship out in, I believe, New York Harbor. His palate was resected or taken out, and they put a piece of vulcanized rubber up in his palate to seal up the defect. Vulcanized rubber is what we make hockey pucks out of, so he's the first president, I guess, to have a hockey puck in his head. Another interesting medical, kind of cover-up. I mean, the cover-ups really abound with JFK, but JFK suffered from Addison's disease, which is a deficiency of steroid, your body's ability to make steroid, and took medication for that his entire life. But he also suffered from debilitating back pain as a result of war injuries that he suffered in the Second World War and wore quite an interesting back brace that I don't have a picture of actually in here. So it's not the first or the last, but as a neurologist, I'm more interested actually in neurological diseases than others. Again, I'm not so sure I should even be showing this picture in this house, but here's William Howard Taft, Teddy Roosevelt's picked heir apparent. Taft never wanted to be president. Roosevelt wanted Taft to be president, and Mrs. Taft wanted Mr. Taft to be president, but all Mr. Taft wanted to do was be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, which mercifully he was able to become eventually before he died. What's tragic about Taft's presidency is that shortly after he was elected, Mrs. Taft suffered a very debilitating stroke which left her unable to speak. And it was felt that part of the reason that Taft's presidency was not successful, I mean there are many reasons for this, but don't get me wrong, was that Mrs. Taft, the socialite, the go-getter, the always pushing Mr. Taft, became unable shortly into his presidency to actually help her husband out. And so that many of Taft's difficulties are attributed to this early on in his presidency. All right, so moving on to our next story, we'll talk about FDR. And so FDR, like probably most of us in the room, is a fellow New Yorker. He served as our longest serving president, and for probably ever, he will be our longest serving president, now with term limits. As I mentioned, he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy in Wilson's cabinet. He was the governor of New York before he was elected president, and like Wilson, he was a Democrat. And what we most link FDR to in terms of neurological illnesses is polio. And so what polio is an infection by a virus into a part of the spinal cord that renders the nerve input to the muscle ineffective. And what develops then is weakness. And mercifully, because of public health initiatives and vaccinations, polio has been eradicated from the developed world. It's been eradicated from our country. But back in the day, polio was quite a problem. The question, though, that I have, and it's not just my question, but the question that many neurologists have, is did FDR actually have polio, or did he have something else? So let's talk about this. Let's go through what happened to FDR. So in August of 1921, shortly after as I mentioned before, his unsuccessful bid for the vice presidency, Roosevelt takes his family to their family retreat in Campobello, which is in the Bay of Fundy. And for those of you like me who are pretty bad in Canadian geography, that's where the Bay of Fundy is. It's up here in the eastern provinces. And after swimming, he felt too weak to take off his bathing clothes. He developed what he said a slight case of lumbago, which is an old-fashioned term for low back pain, and he went to bed with severe chills. And the next morning he woke up and he had fever still, and he had worsening back pain, and he noticed that he couldn't move his right leg very well. And then by the next morning, by August 12th, he couldn't move either leg. And very importantly, and I'll explain why this is important later, he told Eleanor, his wife, and many others that were caring for him, is that his skin and his legs was so painful that he could not stand the bed sheets. And why that's important is that while weakness is certainly a symptom of polio, pain or numbness or sensitivity to touch is not a symptom of polio. It's a symptom that there's something going on with the sensory system in the nervous system in addition to the motor system. So we'll kind of come back to that. The next day he develops weakness in his arms or his upper extremities, and he's initially seen by this physician, this Army physician, Dr. William Keene, who said he had a stroke in his spinal cord. Now, we talked about strokes a little while ago when we talked about Mr. Wilson's case, and strokes in the brain are quite common. Strokes in the brain can occur for a number of different reasons, but strokes in the spinal cord are extremely, extremely rare. So, as an example, I've been in practice now 10 years. I've seen hundreds and hundreds, if not over 1,000 strokes in the brain. I can count on these two fingers, or these three fingers, how many spinal cord strokes I've seen. Spinal cord strokes are usually a complication of a major surgery, like a surgery on the heart or the big vessels leading from the heart, like the aorta, where it rarely can be seen in people who go very deep sea diving, who are predisposed or experience different pressures in their body. As far as we can tell, swimming in the Bay of Fundy did not include scuba diving, and there was no scuba diving in 1921. And unless we're missing something big time, he did not have major aortic surgery, which probably wouldn't have survived in 1921 anyway. So that diagnosis was incorrect. And what further refutes that diagnosis is that about 2 weeks later, he develops weakness in the face. And in just basics of neuroanatomy, the face is supplied by nerves that are above the spinal cord. So we know it's not a spinal cord stroke. And then what happens is, I think I skipped a slide. Maybe not. So then what happens is he undergoes a spinal tap or a lumbar puncture to, quote, relieve pressure on the swollen cord. Now, that is actually malpractice. So you never want to do a spinal tap on someone who's got a swollen spinal cord because you could cause major, major, major dysfunction. So that was not good. Unfortunately for our case, his cerebrospinal fluid, that clear fluid that bathes our brain and spine, that is what we were looking to get when we do a spinal tap, wasn't analyzed. And it could have been analyzed in 1921 based on the technology they had. And why it's unfortunate is that the cerebrospinal fluid analysis might have shed more light on the diagnosis, but it's lost somewhere. It's probably not around. By August 30th, Dr. Robert Lovett comes to evaluate FDR. Lovett was another preeminent neurologist of his time, but I accuse Dr. Lovett of holding a hammer and seeing everything as a nail, because Dr. Lovett was the world's expert in poliomyelitis at the time. So in medicine, a lot of times we have our favorite diseases, and we like to kind of see our favorite diseases. One of the exercises I do when I see one of my favorite diseases is I try to convince myself it's not that. And then when I think it is, then I get excited. But he diagnosed him with polio. And we'll talk about why that may not have been accurate. He gets intensive physical therapy, particularly in swimming, which is a good thing because FDR is an avid swimmer. Over time, the pain and the weakness in his face and his arms gradually improves, but there's no improvement in his lower extremity strength. And this is a problem. And this is a problem because I mentioned before the Democrats are not in a good way at this point in time. They've just lost yet another presidential election. There don't seem to be many stars on the horizon in terms of people that they feel like they can run for office. And so FDR's reputation has to be preserved. So for the media, when he's recovering, they show FDR standing straight. He's got one cane here. He's doing fine. He's getting better. What you don't see is that he's holding another cane behind this arm, and he's leaning heavily against the door, so he can't stand. And when it becomes apparent that his legs aren't going to get better, he buys the top-of-the-line prosthetic of the time for the charge of, I think it's $155 here, if I can read that correctly, $135. this is way ahead of its time. I mean, every time I give this talk, I'm fascinated by the technology that was developed for him back in the 1920s. This was the brace he wore. This one around his waist, and here are locking joints at the knee, and these obviously slipped through his shoes. And so the knees were locking and unlocking so that when he stood, he could lock the joints and stand up straight without crumbling over. And when he wanted to sit, there was a hinge that he could unlock it and sit. And so, for example, here's a photograph that never would have been released in his lifetime. You can see him standing here holding this document. If you notice down here, you can see the braces surrounding his shoes. And you can see the cane kind of draped over the chair. You can see him holding on for dear life to this chair. This guy's allowed to wear crutches, but not FDR, okay? And so it was told to the media when FDR was elected president, once the bid for the presidency was successful, that the president will never be photographed in a compromising position, or you will never take a photograph of the president again. And the media respected that, which I find phenomenal, because there's no way in heck the media would respect anything like that these days. And so I think it's just an interesting comment on the times that people's dignity was respected. You can see in this photograph, which again never would have been released during his lifetime, notice his legs. His legs are very, very thin. I mean, he's got very nice definition in his arms. You can see some nice musculature in his arms. But both legs are really, really skinny. They're like twigs, and his foot muscles are like very atrophied or wasted away as well. Now, this could occur in polio. It could really occur in any neurological disorder where the nerves are affected as well. But this is an interesting photograph I found. And you might say, well, how did he actually operate his car? There's a lot of video and a lot of footage of FDR driving around in a car. Well, again, just to speak to the amazing properties of technology back in the 30s, he actually had hand gears created, so he could brake and push the gas with his arm and not with his legs when he drove. It also speaks to his amazing wealth. So the question that I have, and other neurologists have looked at this before, kind of as a forensic investigation, because we obviously don't have the opportunity to examine FDR and go through his case again at this day and age, but we can evaluate the medical descriptions of his symptoms, we can evaluate the medical records, and the question is, did he have what's called Guillain-Barre Syndrome? So Guillain-Barre Syndrome is a disorder where a person develops an infection, usually an innocuous upper respiratory infection or gastrointestinal infection, and the body's immune system fights that infection. But unfortunately, the body's immune system goes a little haywire and creates proteins not only against that virus or bacteria, but also against the nerves. And 2 or 3 weeks after a person develops the upper respiratory infection or the GI infection, they then develop rapidly progressive weakness and sensory symptoms involving the arms, the legs, sometimes the face, sometimes the breathing muscles. And so what goes along in FDR's case, more in the line of Guillain-Barre syndrome than polio, is Dr. Goldman, who looked at this back in 2003, is if you look at Roosevelt's case, which all these are obviously highlighted, and you look at what goes along more with GBS or Guillain-Barre syndrome and what goes more along with polio, you can see that statistically speaking, or common things being more common, the symptoms and signs that he exhibited are more in line with Guillain-Barre syndrome than they are with polio. But the fact of the matter is, who cares? And why I say that is that if this was to occur in 2018, we have a treatment for Guillain-Barre syndrome. We can treat that, especially early on in the disease course. In 1921, there was no treatment for polio. There was no treatment for Guillain-Barre syndrome. So this is largely an intellectual exercise. But I think it's interesting because he went his whole life telling folks and believing, I truly believe, that he had polio, when in point of fact he may not have. And why I say that is that, again, he was an adult when he got this. Mostly children got polio. The time course of his symptoms was more in line with Guillain-Barre. And he developed sensory symptoms. He had numbness, he had pain. I told you to remember when I mentioned that he had pain in the skin of his legs. That would be seen classically in Guillain-Barre syndrome, but not necessarily in polio. Just an interesting little point of trivia. But FDR's neurological history really gets more interesting from this point on. So FDR was cared for by probably the best doctors of his time. So his actual White House physician was Ross McIntyre, who was a naval physician. He was actually an ear, nose, and throat doctor, but he was a protege of someone we heard about already in the story, and that's Dr. Cary Grayson. So he was Dr. Cary Grayson's protege, and he knew how to care for presidents, and he knew how to cover things up for presidents. He was also cared for by Dr. Howard Bruin. Dr. Bruin was a cardiologist in the Leahy Clinic in Burlington, Mass. And Dr. Bruin treated FDR for congestive heart failure with this, which is digitalis, which is a medicine we still use today. It's being used 70 years later. So this is the foxglove plant. This is where digitalis comes from. And basically what this medication does in layman's terms is it makes the heart pump stronger. Congestive heart failure is kind of a weak pump or a weak pushing heart. Digitalis makes it pump a little faster, or a little harder, excuse me. In addition to congestive heart failure, there's an assertion that FDR probably had melanoma. This becomes important later. But I always recommend this book every time I give this talk because this is a great book about FDR's medical history in general. It's a very easy read. It was written by a neurologist and a guy that can actually write. It's a quick, very interesting read. But the gist of the story in this book is that FDR probably had melanoma. You can see it here. Melanoma is a skin cancer derived from melanin cells, which gives skin pigment. And these lesions, like this one here and possibly this one here, were repeatedly kind of taken off of FDR or airbrushed out of photos. And why it's interesting is that it's very possible that melanoma, this melanoma in his case, spread to his brain. Melanoma loves to spread or metastasize to the brain. And this may have been the cause not only of some of Roosevelt's problems towards his death, but his actual death. So one of the things that can happen when cancer spreads to the brain, or frankly, one of the things that can happen if someone has narrowing of the arteries because of uncontrolled high blood pressure, like in Roosevelt's case, is people can develop seizures. Now, when most people think of a seizure, they think of the type of thing where someone kind of abruptly loses consciousness, they may let out a scream, they fall on the floor, they become stiff, they shake a little bit, they pee their pants, and a little while later they wake up. And that is certainly one type of seizure. But another type of seizure may be like that, right? So a little bit of loss of consciousness, maybe a little bit of abnormal movement, but it's subtle. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that FDR may have had complex partial seizures. So, for example, Turner Catledge, who was a reporter for the New York Times and later became editor-in-chief of the New York Times, interviewed Roosevelt. He said that he, meaning FDR, would start talking about something and then in mid-sentence he would stop and his mouth would drop open and he'd sit staring at me in silence, and repeatedly he would lose his train of thought, stop and stare blankly at me. So the question is, was he having little repetitive seizures during this interview? And this was so well known that FDR was doing this that his military advisor, General Paul Watson, once told Senator Frank Maloney, "Don't worry, he'll come out of it. He always does." So, General Watson saw this so many times, he was used to it. He knew it would happen, and he would come out of it. Just to kind of bring a neurological twist, Paul Watson, picture here, died of a massive stroke on the way back from Yalta. So there's strokes everywhere in this story. We'll talk more about Yalta in a minute. So it's possible that FDR had repeated seizures. It's also possible that his uncontrolled hypertension or high blood pressure also caused his brain to become dysfunctional at times. And this is an interesting graph that I found that documents or details FDR's documented blood pressures over the course of his presidencies. And you can see that on important days like on D-Day, June 6, 1944, his blood pressure was recorded as about 225 over 125. Now, by way of reference, a normal blood pressure is usually about 120 over 80, so this is doubled. Around the time of the Yalta conference, it's around the same as on D-Day, and as I'll show you, his last recorded blood pressure was over 300 systolic. Now, I still don't understand that there's not many blood pressure cuffs or sphygmomanometers that'll record that high, but nevertheless, I'll show you what his last blood pressure reading was before he died in April of 1945. So this is Yalta. I mentioned Yalta a minute ago. This is the meeting of the big three, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. Essentially what's happening here is that it's obvious Germany is going to lose the war. We need to figure out what's going to happen in Europe after Germany's finally defeated. And hey, Joe, would you mind helping us in Japan once the Germans are defeated? And Churchill is distraught after this conference because, as you all probably know, FDR and Churchill developed quite a symbiotic and nice relationship during the war. And Churchill's distraught after Yalta because he feels that FDR doesn't look good. And he also is distraught by the fact that FDR promised Stalin half of Eastern Europe, or most of Eastern Europe, and basically kind of sold England down the river in order for Stalin to assure the U.S. That he would become involved in Japan after the Germans were defeated. So you can see Churchill looks great, Stalin looks angry, but that's what Stalin looked like. By the way, both of these guys died of stroke. It's true. In Stalin's case, he was likely poisoned by his bodyguards. So he was likely poisoned by warfarin, which is an anticoagulant drug, which he took which he was likely given by his bodyguards to kill him. You notice FDR doesn't look so good, and moreover, he decides it's probably a good time for a smoke too. Why not? Your blood pressure's already 250, you might as well just go for it. So FDR goes to Yalta, he comes back, on the way back, Paul Watson dies, and he gives this speech, this nationally, I don't want to say televised because it wasn't, but radio speech to Congress. And what's interesting about this speech is a number of things. First off, he comes into the chamber and sits down, and he says something to the effect, I'm paraphrasing, that I hope you don't mind if I sit down right now, but you all realize that it's very difficult for me to stand because of all the lead I'm hanging around my legs. So he kind of just blew the cover up, or at least acknowledged the fact that he was wearing braces. And then what happens is most people remember Roosevelt as being a very, very good speaker, probably unlike myself this evening, but he delivered a terrible speech. And why he delivered a terrible speech is that he was reading his speech. And why it was so bad is that it's asserted that he could not see the left side of the page because he had a problem in the right side of his brain not allowing him to see the left side of the page. And so it's said that folks that witnessed this said that he actually would go through and read the speech line by line, which he never did. And all of the errors in his speech, if you look at the written speech, which I've done, and you listen to the speech, all of the errors in this speech occur on the left side of the page. So probably had something going on the right side of his brain that was impairing the left side of his visual fields, and also may have been causing seizures. So what could that thing be? Again, could it be a spread of melanoma? We'll never know, or will we? So this is the day before Roosevelt dies. You can see this is a black and white photo. To say he's got no color in his face is kind of a bad joke, but you can see he doesn't look good. One of the first things you'll learn in medical school is it a man or is it a woman? Is it alive or is it dead? And is it sick or is it not sick? And this looks sick, okay? So that's like day 3 of medical school. It's a long time ago. So he doesn't look so good. He's sitting for a portrait. Interestingly, he's in Warm Springs, Georgia. He's not with Mrs. Roosevelt. He's with his cousin and his girlfriend around the time of his death. And on April 12th, he dies. So, that's the cover of the New York Times the day of his death. So how does he die? So he's in, as I said, Warm Springs, Georgia. He's relaxing, and his last words are, I have a terrific pain in the back of my head. And then right after that, he develops very quickly an inability to move the left side of his body, or a hemiplegia, weakness on one side. Dr. Bruin, the cardiologist I mentioned before, was traveling with him, and he comes 15 minutes later, and he finds that the pupil in the right eye is fixed and dilated, and what that means is that it's not responding. If you shine a light into your eye, your pupils will go down, and if there's something pressing on the nerve kind of going towards the eye, such as a giant bleed in the brain, that will prevent those nerve impulses from getting there. So something going on in the right eye, the left side of his body, something giant happened to the right side of his brain. It was a giant bleed in his brain. I'd tell you about his last blood pressure. It was recorded at 300 over 190. That's incompatible with life. He's given a number of medicines we don't really give today except for nitroglycerin in an attempt to lower his blood pressure, but it's futile. And remarkably, 2 hours and 25 minutes later he dies. And why I say remarkably is that in my experience, unfortunately, caring for folks with these problems, they usually go much faster. This is usually a matter of minutes after you find these findings. So several hours later, when the Secret Service could find Harry Truman, they brought him to Mrs. Roosevelt. And why I say they could find Harry Truman is that Harry Truman was a very antsy guy. And he hated being stuck in an office. He hated the Secret Service. And so he used to sneak out of his window and take walks down the mall every day. And the Secret Service kind of knew this. They kind of let it happen. But this day it was important to find him, so they found Mr. Truman on the mall, walking the mall. They said, we really need you to see Mrs. Roosevelt now. So they bring President Truman, or then Vice President Truman, into Mrs. Roosevelt. And Mrs. Roosevelt says, Harry, I'm very sorry, but the president is dead. You are now the president. Is there anything I can do for you? And Harry Truman says to her, is there anything I can do for you? And she says, no, Harry, is there anything we can do for you? And it's really telling, because though Roosevelt handpicked Truman to be his vice president for his last term, fully acknowledging his health, he never really kind of debriefed Truman as to what was going on. So Truman, really inherited a mess without much being known. But he did a fairly good job. So this is kind of a whirlwind tour of medical illnesses and presidency. Obviously, as a neurologist, I'm mostly interested in neurological diseases. I think that these stories are interesting. They show, on one hand, in Roosevelt's case, how despite a fairly debilitating illness and sequelae or residual of that illness, he was able to achieve great things. It also shows that you really need to treat that high blood pressure if you have it, because good things won't happen. And in Wilson's case, I think it's interesting in terms of the stroke that he had, the deficits, the cognitive deficits that it left him, and the fact that it was covered up for so long. He was allowed to act as president, or his wife was allowed to act as president for so long. How much do we know about our president's health? How much should we know? Having given this talk many times, a lot of interesting questions arise, one of which being, well, the president is the commander-in-chief of the Army. Anyone that enters the Army, or the services rather, anyone that enters the service has to take a physical. Why shouldn't the president have to take a physical first? A lot of questions. I'm very grateful to have been here. This was the original ending slide for this talk. I've not changed this because I am a big fan of TR. It's just I'm very honored to have been able to present here this evening. I'm happy to answer any of your questions, but I will say it with this. For reasons I'm sure you can imagine, will not answer any questions at all on the current president. Thank you.